Okay, good evening, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. It's 6:01, and we are excited to share this third event in our winter workshop series with you all. My name is Tova Tillinghast, and I am the Underwood Conservation District Director. And thank you all for taking the time to be with us here. Tonight, we'll be learning about some of the exciting ways to build soil health, store carbon, and dispose of woody debris through biochar. We're very lucky to have our guest Kelpie Wilson of Wilson Biochar here with us tonight to share biochar science and the practical approaches to biochar creation and application. Tonight's event is also co-sponsored by the local chapter of the Washington Farm Forestry Association. So in a few moments, Casey Stoltz will describe what this group does and how you can join in the fun. Last month's winter workshop covered many of the projects that we've recently completed here at Underwood Conservation District throughout Skamania and Western Klickitat counties, as well as some of the programs and services that are available to you and your neighbors. At December's winter workshop, we learned about the tree of heaven and its potential companion, the spotted lanternfly. And this is an emerging and important issue that really all residents of the Columbia River Gorge and the Pacific Northwest need to know about. So if you missed either of these workshops, do not fret. All of our workshops, including last year's, have been recorded and are available to view on our website under News and Events. We also usually have the slides assembled into a PDF slide deck for future reference. So if you want to go back and learn about any of these topics at a later date, please go for it. And if you know someone who should have attended tonight's workshop but couldn't make it, please send them to our website in the next week or so, and you'll be able to find tonight's recording. So we also have our native plant sale going on right now. Let me move on to this slide here. You've probably heard of our native plant sale that happens every year, and it ends on February 28th. Plants will be available for pickup on March 18th at our event called Tree Fest in White Salmon. So mark your calendars and come on out to join us at Tree Fest, where we'll have more native plants available for purchase that day, along with a wide variety of community partners, activities, live music, and fun. I hope you'll come and see us there. To stay up to date on all of our most recent news and updates from UCD, please sign up for our UCD e-newsletter, and you can do that on our website. And stay tuned on all of our programs and services through the website. There's a lot there that we keep up to date. One other very exciting event that we have this month is a special pre-release screening of the film Elemental. This is a film about wildfires in the Northwest, and this will be held at the Bingen Theater a week from tonight, Thursday, February 16th at 6:30 p.m. We'll post the links, or we have just posted the links for more information and tickets in the chat. So make sure you go there to find your tickets. And really, we're excited to show this film and have a really thought-provoking discussion afterwards. The film itself has been lauded as a visually stunning film, providing a roadmap for badly needed changes that will benefit thousands of people, particularly in fire-prone communities. The film has been selected for over 30 films thus far and will be premiering nationwide in April. After the screening of Elemental next Thursday night, filmmaker Trip Jennings and special guests from Underwood Conservation District, Washington Department of Natural Resources, and Mount Adams Resource Stewards will be available for a Q&A discussion on how people can prepare for wildfires in the Columbia Gorge. This is sure to be thought-provoking, so please come out and join us for this special pre-release showing. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jan Thomas here at UCD. She is tonight's moderator, and she's going to run us through a few logistics as we get to just get started here tonight.
Hi, good evening. Welcome, everyone. I am going to be kind of in the background here, helping to moderate the room. We do have a pretty large group tonight, so I will ask you to help me out by making sure that you are all on mute unless you are actively talking. We can take questions in the chat at any time, and we'll make sure we get back to those and address them. We'll also have a dedicated Q&A time at the end. In that time at the end, if you want to raise your hand so you can just ask a question directly, that would be great. We'll go ahead and just call on people to make sure that we keep things pretty organized. I think we're all pretty familiar with Zoom and these virtual platforms by now, but there is down at the bottom or wherever you've got the kind of mute, unmute camera bar, there should be a raise hand function, and that's what we'll ask you to do for the Q&A at the end. You can also, like I said, type things into the chat box, and I'm happy to read that out as well for our questions. We are going to have 2 polls tonight, one here in the beginning and then one to end. Those should just pop up on your screen for you. You can answer the questions, and once you're done, it will go away. I'll share those verbally with everybody so we can hear what all the results were for the group. If you're having any trouble with audio, visual, anything like that, you can chat to me directly, and I can try to troubleshoot that with you. Also, you know, obviously just leaving and coming back in usually clears some of that stuff. So let me know if you're having any troubles, but otherwise we will get going and yeah, turn it back to Tova. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jan. All right, so we are finding that this online approach to our workshops has worked pretty well over the course of the pandemic. And of course, we miss seeing everyone face to face, but hopefully you're enjoying the comforts of your own home and that you're able to sit back and relax and enjoy your favorite beverage while you listen tonight. We're also excited to see increased geographic reach through these events. And really tonight, we're seeing much higher numbers than we might see in a in-person event. So we're excited to be able to reach folks from any location with internet. So hopefully you'll be patient with us as we go through this on a screen. And thanks in advance. Now we'd like to know more about you in the audience, especially where you're located and if you live in the Columbia Gorge region or beyond. So we're going to put up a quick poll here, and if you can run through and select your answers, we will also display the results.
Poll should be up and visible for everyone, so let me know if you're not seeing it. Just give folks another second or two here to finish this up. We've got most people have weighed in. Okay, that's great. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share the results we have here. And also share them out loud so we can do it that way. So just real quick, it looks like most of the folks here are either from Clicktack County or other. So we got about 60% Clicktack County, 8% Skamania, and 33% other. Large majority of landowners or land managers, 93% said yes to that. Split over the size of property, but mostly in that 40 acre and below. About 70% or so in that 40 acres and below, and few in higher categories. We asked if you had livestock of any type at all, and that's pretty well split. We got 40% yes and 60% no. pretty good split on whether or not folks are familiar with the Underwood Conservation District and with the WFFA. So hopefully you could all see those results as I was sharing. Turn it back. Thanks for participating.
Yeah, thank you. All right, now our co-sponsor with Washington Farm Forestry Association is going to describe a little bit about their group. We have Casey Stoltz here. So if Casey could unmute and take the stage.
Okay, thanks, Tova. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so my name is Casey Stoltz, and I'm the president of our local WFFA chapter. So that stands for Washington Farm Forestry Association. It's a nonprofit organization, and there's 50 chapters across the state. The Mount Adams chapter is made up of Skamania and Klickitat counties. And most of us are small forest landowners, and we have about anywhere between 1 acre and 100 acres. And WFFA, I think, is a really great way to meet other landowners and share resources. I personally learned a lot from the other members in our chapter. A lot of us have overlapping goals, not just harvesting timber, but goals like improving forest health, enhancing wildlife habitat, and a big one is wildfire risk mitigation. The Mount Adams chapter, we typically meet quarterly, about once every season, and many of our meetings are held at one of the landowners' properties. And everyone has pretty unique trees and forests, so typically the host will discuss some forestry projects that they've completed and other things that they're concerned about, whether it's weeds or root rot or how they get larger trees cleared out of their property. So we might walk around a trail that someone cleared, and we'll all discuss how they made the path, what equipment was used, and benefits of thinning and pruning and weed control. A common goal we share is creating a healthy forest that we can enjoy for years to come. And again, it's not just about selling timber. A lot of us just want to be able to enjoy our own land and create a healthy forest. And we also get guest speakers occasionally. Our December meeting was held at the Glenwood Grange, and we had 2 guest speakers from the DNR Wildland Fire Management Division come, and they presented one of the new DNR programs called Wildfire Ready Neighbors. And we'll occasionally get speakers like that. And again, it's just a really great way to share resources and get to know local people, whether they're foresters, DNR, people from UCD, to just gather information about what everyone else is doing to improve their land. And anyone can join. It's called WFFA, but it's not strictly limited to Washington residents. So anyone in Hood River, for example, could join. And if you want to learn more about it, the website is listed below. You can read about membership dues and certain benefits of being a member, or you can email me directly. I don't have our next meeting scheduled yet. It will probably be in April, but we're always looking for new members. It's a really nice and fun group, and we learn a lot from each other. So the more members, the more we can share, the more we can help each other out and connect with local resources. So I'll share my email, I guess, at the end of this meeting. But yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Casey. Great. I'm going to shift back over to UCD and just provide a really brief background about what Underwood Conservation District is, just so you know who we are, that we're a local resource for landowners and land managers. And this is just a quick background slide about when we were established. The Washington State Legislature adopted a revised Code of Washington, Chapter 8908, that established conservation districts in the state. And then shortly thereafter, Underwood Conservation District was established in 1940. And as the name implies, we were established in Underwood first and slowly expanded and added to our district area to now include all of Skamania County and Western Klickitat County. We're guided and governed really by a local volunteer board of 5 supervisors. And in those early days, the district was made up of our board of supervisors only. And it was only in the last few decades that we've added staff and more capacity to what we do. And here is a map of all the conservation districts in Washington state. So you can see where we're located down at Underwood Conservation District. But anywhere you go in Washington state and even throughout the United States, you'll find yourself usually in a conservation district. So even if you're not right here in our district, there's a lot of opportunity to connect with your local conservation district. And I like to say Underwood is quite unique in that we're the only conservation district here in Washington that crosses the Cascade Range. So we get to cover both the west and east sides of the Cascades. And here's a little closer view of our district area and some of the main communities in our district. And so we really focus primarily on the private lands, especially along the Columbia River and up some of the main tributaries like the White Salmon, Klickitat, and Wind Rivers. So we primarily work with private landowners on a variety of natural resource issues, but we can also do projects on public land when the stars align. So here's a list of some of the things that we do at the Conservation District. We hold workshops like this. We provide on-site technical assistance in conservation planning and even project development for a variety of different types of lands. We hold our native plant sale every year along with the Tree Fest event that I mentioned. We help people with invasive weeds and beneficial insect habitat and fish habitat. We've done quite a few different fish passage barrier corrections where maybe a culvert was undersized or a small dam blocked passage in a stream. And we've worked to correct those to open up fish passage and habitat. We work with farmers on a variety of issues, whether it's irrigation efficiencies or livestock, best management practices. We now have the Farm Tool Library, which is, I'll talk about in just a minute, and that's an exciting new program for us. And we also work with forest landowners on a variety of issues, especially with wildfire fuels reduction and wildfire resilience. So lastly, I'll mention the Yard by Yard Habitat program, which is relatively new as well. It can apply to urban and rural landowners, but it really does give urban landowners a way to make an impact with their smaller lots to implement all kinds of good practices to conserve water and protect habitat and enhance beneficial insect habitat and all kinds of things. So look us up. The Yard by Yard Habitat program is on our website, along with all of these others, or give us a call if you have a certain program or interest in any of this. For forest land owners, such as possibly some of you, we can provide home hazard assessments, and we've been supporting the DNR's Wildfire Ready Neighbors program, as Casey mentioned. We do small woodland assessments, and we can refer folks to foresters who do larger forest management planning projects. You've probably heard of our mobile chipper program, which is always popular, but the funding for that is not always consistent. So check in with us about that program. Right now, we have funding for mobile chipping in Skamania County. But we hope to change that soon to extend into Klickitat County. And then listed on the slide, there are a few other resources that you probably already know about, but we do have partners in the area that are also doing some important forestry work, and we encourage you to contact them if that seems like the right fit for you. I already mentioned the Wildfire Ready Neighbors campaign, and some of that will be ongoing this spring and summer with DNR. For farmlands, we provide similar services in that we can do on-site technical assistance and provide good advice on best management practices and potentially develop cost share projects. We assist folks again with livestock, water quality, irrigation improvements, all types of different projects. And As I mentioned, there's the farm tool library that's new. We're going to be opening it up again this spring and making tools available. We do have tools for burn pile management. And we also have tools for sifting compost and harvesting your crops and managing your weeds. So check out our inventory on the Farm Tool Library website, and you can always call us and find out more about that. And then again, there's partnering agencies that work with farmland issues throughout the gorge as well, and they're listed on your screen. So with that, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Kelpie Wilson. She is our guest speaker tonight, and she's also a mechanical engineer and analyst with 35 years of experience in renewable energy, sustainable forestry, and resource conservation. She has worked in the biochar industry since 2008 and was a founding board member of the U.S. Biochar Initiative. She manages the Biochar in the Woods network to promote biochar production in place to benefit native ecosystems. Kelpie researches and teaches techniques for using biochar in compost and manure management and presents many biochar workshops each year to farmers, foresters, and landowners. She lives in rural Oregon. Excuse me, I just lost my screen for a second. She lives in rural Oregon where she makes biochar compost and grows a large organic vegetable garden. So Kelpie, you can go ahead and share your slides.
All right.
Away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for tuning in tonight. I'm really pleased to be able to be here and speak with you and share some of the really fun things I've learned about biochar over the years. So it's going to be a long program. I've got probably at least an hour worth of material. I'll probably go a little fast sometimes. So it's a good thing it's being recorded because if you get a little lost, maybe you can go back and watch the recording. All right, so I'll just jump right in here. So yeah, as Tova said, I've been doing this for a while, been a consultant since 2012. Before that, I worked with the International Biochar Initiative. And before that, I was a journalist. And before that, I was a forest protection advocate. So, and started off with this degree in engineering. So I've lived in Southwest Oregon and Cave Junction since 1990. So I have a lot of history with forests and with environmental issues and growing organic gardens and so forth. And it all comes together with biochar. Biochar really ties it all together for me. So let's start with what is biochar. It's really something pretty new. I first heard of it in 2007. I was immediately intrigued. But it's really just charcoal. And however, it's charcoal that you can put in soil because charcoal can have a lot of different properties. Like if you have fuel charcoal, lump hardwood charcoal, or charcoal briquettes you would put in your barbecue, you don't want to use that. It's got more tar and oil and stuff than is really good for soil. So it has to be clean, basically. And so what does it do? Well, sometimes you can see dramatic results because it adds carbon to soil. It helps conserve water. It prevents nutrient loss. It buffers soil pH. Our forests, forest soils, forest-derived soils are usually pretty high pH, so that's a benefit. And it promotes and enhances the soil microbial life, which we're all learning about is really important. And at the end of the day, it can increase plant growth. This particular picture is very dramatic because this was in a metal contaminated soil. So it's really useful for very poor, very degraded soils is where you're going to see the most dramatic difference using biochar. But we know that it has benefits in many, many situations because of natural biochar. So the most fertile soils in the world are the soils that have a lot of natural charcoal from prairie fires or forest fires. And so Iowa soils, some of the most fertile in the world, half of the carbon in those soils is charcoal. And that happens in a prairie fire because the tall grasses, taller than a person, would just flash burn and have a quick input of heat. And then, then it would be done. And where the grass clumps are very close to the ground where they emerge from the roots. It's very thick. And so it would exclude the air and it wouldn't keep burning. It would just stop burning and you would be left with the char. And then of course there are many in the US, Native Americans did a lot of cultural burning that's left a legacy of char. And this is true actually all around the world where, indigenous people, native people to the land created soils or enhanced soils by using fire. And of course, the most dramatic example here is in the Amazon. I got to visit a terra preta site in the Amazon back in 2010. And, we all got to climb down in this pit and see the black soil and see the pottery shards sticking out of the sides of the pit. So you knew these were created by humans. And then, this montage just shows how different it is. These native soils, highly leached. The rain just washes every nutrient out of the soil. All the nutrients are in the living biomass in a rainforest like that. And it was very interesting to realize that there was actually quite a major civilization on the high bluffs along the main stem and tributaries of the Amazon. More people living there before Columbus than there are today. One of the places we visited there was a farm growing produce for the city of Manaus. And, that farmland is very valuable. And these pottery shards were everywhere. So you're really, walking on the remains of an amazing agricultural civilization where until recently, nobody thought you could grow anything there. And that's because of the charcoal that they added to soil, probably also with manure and other organic wastes, fish bones and stuff like that. And, when you start looking at the history, you see that pretty much every successful long-lived civilization, agricultural civilization, returned human manure to the soil. They had a program of returning nutrients to the soil. The Chinese are famous for the night soil. But even in cities in Europe, there were whole systems before the flush toilet for collecting and, bringing these nutrients back to the farm soils. So, and just to mention, oftentimes ashes, they would call it ashes, but there was usually a lot of char in there as well. So char could help preserve the nutrients. That's really the main takeaway for why these soils are so fertile. So how does that work? How does biochar preserve nutrients? What is it doing in the soil? Why is it so great? Well, the key to understanding it is to look at the scale, because biochar works on different scales. And you've got your macro scale, which is our human scale, the micro scale, which is, you can see it in a regular microscope, and then the nanoscale, which is atoms and molecules, and you can only see those with an electron microscope. So at the cellular scale or the micro scale, let's look at that first. You can look even with a hand lens and you can see the cells in some wood, and you can see the vascular structure, where the sap flows. And when you heat it, that will shrink, that material will shrink, but it will kind of retain its structure. So you still see those pores. And those pores are really important to how biochar works. Then at the nanoscale, something really interesting is going on, because you take wood, for instance, it's made of lignin and cellulose, and lignin is the strongest part that really helps a tree stand up. And it's strong because it has a lot of these hexagonal carbon rings. That's what these are, 6-sided molecules of carbon. And they're very stable and strong. They have strong bonds. But when you add heat, you can see here there's a lot of oxygen and hydrogen attached to the carbon rings. That goes off as a gas. And the remaining carbon rings tend to link up together and make these sheets. They fuse. We call it fused carbon rings. And those fused sheets are even stronger. And so that's why biochar lasts so long in the soil. So microbes just can't really attack them very easily. Those bonds are too strong. And so biochar can last for thousands of years in the soil. That's why you can go to a 10,000-year-old village site and dig up an old fire pit and pull some charcoal out and carbon date it. And it's still there, because it doesn't really break down. So for instance, just the difference between, say you have some wood chips and they're lying on the ground, and with some variability, they're going to start losing their carbon. Microbes are going to eat them, they're going to rot, and all the carbon will go back to the air. And so, within 5-10 years, it's gone. The carbon is back in the air as carbon dioxide. But the biochar, if you take the same chip and you turn it into charcoal, the process of turning it into charcoal will lose carbon, about half the carbon gone, in the exhaust from the burning. But the rest of it, it's just flat here. This line can go on for thousands of years. So that's why it can be a climate solution, because that carbon's going to stay. It's not going to be degraded very easily. And then the other really neat thing besides the stability is the electrical properties of it. So those carbon rings, the way there's something about the way they all bond, where the electrons are free to move around the whole circle here. And that makes those electrons available for a lot of different chemical reactions and biological reactions that are very interesting and add to the properties of biochar in soil. So what you have is all these pores, from the structure of the wood or the other biomass. And then, the nanoscale, you've got these fused carbon rings. At the microscale, you've got all these pores. And then inside those pores is just huge amounts of surface area. So, really a lot of surface area. And that's where the action is, because that's where your microbes are living. And these microbes are attached to these electrically charged surfaces. And what we find a lot with biochar is you get a more biological diversity in the microbial populations in soils with biochar, because they can live together more easily. And so one of the reasons for that is because of electron exchange. So one microbe might need an electron to complete a reaction for its metabolic process, whereas another one next door wants to get rid of an electron to complete a reaction. So they can exchange electrons, and that makes their whole environment more efficient. And so they're sitting there on these biochar surfaces, and it's like luxury condos for microbes. They've got electric, they've got water, and they've got food because of all the nutrients and water that also are held in there. So that's really the crux of it. The water holding capacity of biochar is really interesting and important. And this is more because of its sponge property, because of all the pores in it, and also the spaces between the particles of char and other soil particles just help the soil hold more water. So when I was visiting biochar test plots at Iowa State back in 2012, it was a bad drought year in the Midwest, and the Iowa soils were doing better than other states because they have more natural biochar in soil, more carbon in the soil. But even with those good soils, when they added more biochar, it held more water. So it's a bit of a linear relationship generally between water holding and the amount of char in the soil. And then there's the nutrients that stick to those electrically active surfaces. And this slide is, don't worry, there's no test. It's some pretty complicated chemistry here, but the gist of it is that your cations are going to be loosely held, and so by biochar surfaces, and those are important nutrients. There's something called cation exchange capacity that's usually measured in healthy soil that is got a lot of nutrients available to plants. And then you also have organic compounds like humic acid and things like that will stick to biochar surfaces, and those are acidic, and those will hold anions. So you also get anion exchange capacity. So you've got this whole variety of nutrients that can, one way or another, kind of stick to biochar in a loose enough way that they're still available. And then all, minerals as well, and clays. So it just makes a big old, nutrient soup in the soil that plants appreciate. And you can see it in this study. Was really interesting, where they composted biochar with other organic material, because that's how you get those organic compounds on there. And then they, did a bunch of analysis to see what was in there, and there was every kind of nutrient. And then they could also look at this sort of coating, And that comes about, a lot of it, because the microbes are living there and they're eating and they're excreting, and that all sticks as humic substances to the biochar. So I was an investigator on a conservation innovation grant from the NRCS in Oregon a couple of years ago. Worked with a whole bunch of small farmers who had woodlands, so they had forest, and just like a lot of you, and a lot of them also had livestock. So what we were trying to do was make biochar from their tree, their waste, their slash piles and their woody debris, and then compost it with manure from their livestock, and just see if we could make some really valuable compost. And we did. And so, as this example shows, we're just layering goat manure and some straw and some biochar, and it got really hot. I've done a lot of biochar compost experiments, and it's the best thing you could add to compost, because it makes it go so much faster. It's a little bit sensitive as far as heat, whether we could get into compost, but there's aerobic thermophilic compost, and then there's moldering compost. There's a lot of different kinds of compost, but you learn over time how much to add, and you can make some really incredible composts. So, just see these little chunks of char here, and they went through this composting process, and then we did this hot trial to see what that compost did for plants. And when the compost pile was done, and this was all done, I went through and picked out just the chunks of char. So no compost, just the char that had been through the composting process, and got that organic coating on it that I showed you in the earlier slide. So I compared it to some worm castings I had, and the control, which was just a plain peat potting soil. And notice, first of all, germination. Worm castings a lot of times are not quite mature, so they can inhibit germination. But the char really, it absorbed any of the enzymes and things that you might find in immature compost that could inhibit germination. So the germination rate was great. The growth stimulation was fantastic. Just counting the number of secondary leaves and growth nodes, there were much more in the char than the worm castings or the control. And then the biomass, you had quite, visibly you can see we grew more biomass. And this is just a tablespoon of the char picked out of a compost pile and mixed with a plain peat potting soil. So just that small amount had this effect. So that was pretty amazing to me. And now I'll just show you a few pictures from my veggie garden from last summer. It definitely has improved my gardening and my compost. I've been really happy with what I can produce in a very small space. I'm feeding 2 families. And you can see little chunks of char on the top of the soil there. I kind of have it everywhere. We just decided to put all of our produce together in one thing and take a picture. All right, so just a few things about how to, like in summary, how to use biochar. You want to pre-treat it. If you put raw biochar in soil, it starts absorbing things like nitrogen, and unless you're adding a whole lot of nitrogen fertilizer, which you can do, for the first year or so, if you just put it in soil and don't change anything else, and you put a lot in, it can actually inhibit plant growth. But once it kind of gets charged up with nutrients, you start seeing the good results. So here's what you need to pre-treat it, and even just weathering it outside in the rain and weather, that helps start the process of getting microbes to move into it and some nutrients. The best way, though, is if you do have livestock, and I wanted to know how many people did, using it in animal barns, because that's what we did in our conservation innovation grant, was add it to the manure or add it to your aerobic compost, which I do with my other garden waste. You can also, there's a lot of different techniques with anaerobic ferments like bokashi, which you may have heard of, or you can soak it in a liquid fertilizer, urine. manure tea, or even an NPK chemical fertilizer, you can get great results. As far as applications, you know, my approach is to put it in my compost pile and then use the compost. It couldn't be simpler. But you can also, you know, if you're planting trees or transplanting out tomatoes or something, just add some with your other fertilizers in the hole, the transplanting hole. If you're growing crops on a field, you know, you don't need to amend the whole field. You can just put some in the row below the seeds in a band. If you've got garden beds and you don't have, you know, you haven't composted it, you just want to get the char in there, just put about it. If you just put a half an inch thick layer on a garden bed of crushed up charcoal and just scratch it in, that's not too much. That won't do any nutrient tie up, and that's a good way to get started. So I wanted to just share some of the results from our Conservation Innovation Grant using the biochar with manure. So this was a grass-fed beef operation with 800 cattle, and he feeds them in the winter in a feed barn because, you know, when it's really wet, he doesn't want them out compacting the soil. So for a couple months, they're fed in a barn. And what we did was we looked at what happens if you don't add biochar. You would then scrape the barn. The first year we didn't get it in the barn first, so we put it in, we mixed it in with a tractor after the manure had been scraped from the barn. And just looking at the nitrate numbers here, it helped retain more nitrogen, more nitrate. The second year we were able to put the biochar in the barn before the cattle came in. And so they did their business on it for a couple of months. They crushed it with their hooves and mixed it in. And you can see 10 times more nitrate in that compost than in the practice that he had before, which was basically just scraping it out and piling it. So that's, you know, that was pretty darn effective. Another one of the farms we worked with was a goat dairy. And this was just, you know, a pack barn where they clean it out a couple times a year. And, you know, it just, the straw and the alfalfa, the hay and the alfalfa just kind of build up in a pack. And it's pretty bad in there, but it's really bad when you break that pack up because the ammonia you have to wear a respirator. So they started just putting like 10 gallons a week, sprinkled around with a little bit of EM1, which is an acidifier, so it helps inhibit ammonia. And it was fantastic. You know, it composted in place. So when they were cleaned it out, there was no significant ammonia smell. It was already compost. So they were very happy with it. And they started buying biochar. And, you know, it was not an expensive thing to not that much to pay for the benefit they got. And this is sort of their testimonial. So it's just composting right in place. And of course, the animals are appreciating it, and the people who go in the barn appreciate the lack of ammonia smell. All right, so just a couple more ideas about how to apply it, especially if you have a big field. If you apply plain biochar with a legume crop, because the legumes will fix nitrogen, that's a great way to get started with biochar. So with your cover crop with some legumes. And the biochar will also improve the nitrogen fixing bacteria. So you'll see bigger nodules where those pink nitrogen fixing bacteria live on the roots of the legumes. Apply it as compost. And you can do that, you know, with any equipment you have, including just a regular old manure spreader. You can mix it with organic fertilizers and minerals in planting holes and seed rows. Some people are also doing a liquid biochar where they will grind their biochar really thin, really small in a powder, and combine it with other nutrients or biologicals and do a foliar spray. So that's another interesting way to do it. So, you know, one of the other things it does in soil is it creates these kind of activity centers for microbes where it helps form soil aggregates, and NRCS will tell you that's the number one measure of soil health is it forming aggregates, or is it falling apart just like dirt and sand, or is it, if it's making little clumps, then you know that there's biology in there working, and biochar seems to help that. So just kind of in conclusion, to summarize, microbes like biochar. The biochar is stable and it won't degrade over time, so you don't have to keep adding it at a certain point. I probably have enough biochar in my garden now. The soil life binds the soil particles together. That helps the soil hold water and nutrients, and the plant roots are happy. Okay, so now part 2. I'm going to take a drink of water. Now that you've heard about how great it is, I'm sure you want to try to make it or get some. So how do you make biochar? There are so many ways to make it. I mean, humans have been making charcoal forever, but the technical term for making biochar is called pyrolysis. Pyro, and meaning fire, and lysis, which means separation. And basically we're taking our wood fuel and we're driving off the tarry stuff, the hydrogen, and oxygen, and we're left with pure carbon, or something close to pure carbon. So I always like to start off with saying how not to make biochar, because especially early on when we'd be talking about charcoal or biochar, people would say, oh, that's a dirty process. And they're right, because the traditional way of making biochar is to load a bunch of wood in a pit or a mound, and you light one end of it on fire and it smolders for days and days and days. And it's kind of a low temperature process. There's not a lot of flame. It's just kind of smoking. And it's very dirty and not all that efficient. But the smoke comes out of the char with the heat, and a lot of it recondenses back in there. So it's good for fuel because it's got all this tarry stuff in there, but it's not great for soil. So we don't want to do this. There are lots of new techniques for making biochar industrially, and they're very interesting, and they can make biochar out of a lot of different things. You can also produce energy as a byproduct, because the process releases energy, and that's all good. Those are all pretty expensive though, so most of us are not going to be investing millions of dollars in one of these facilities. There's some slightly less expensive modifications to regular biomass energy furnaces that can make biochar. And so, if you're involved in a community energy project, you might want to explore that. And then there's larger biomass power plants that are now producing biochar commercially. This is one in Medford, and they make a really good product, and they make a lot of energy too, and a lot of biochar. And they sell it for $125 a cubic yard. So that gives you an idea of what your labor is worth. If you make a cubic yard of biochar, that's $125, and that doesn't even count what it costs to go get it or deliver it, ship it to you. So, we have a few of these biomass power plants that make biochar, and that's great, but we've got a lot of biomass out there, and we have quite a few issues with climate change, with forest health, and a lot of work that is being done, as you all know. And our forests, I've been working on forestry issues for many decades now, and it's kind of heartbreaking. We're really losing a lot of our forests to drought, climate change, wildfire. And this is important not just for the habitat and all the benefits of forests, but for climate change, because these forests are climate sink now, but they could become a source of carbon. We have to really put some thought into how to do a better job and prevent the decline of our forests. So one of the things that I've learned over the years is that one of the reasons why we have a lot of problem with our forests is we kept fire out. So these forests evolved, they need a regular low intensity fire to be healthy. And we've kept that fire out, and now we have this huge problem. So we need to bring the fire back, but before we do that, we can't, we have got to deal with the fuel loads. So, but just to recognize that actually biochar is a natural component of forest soil, and we need to put it back. So, I mean, that periodic low intensity fire is helps with nutrient cycling. You know, if you just have a lot of dead wood choking a forest, you know, the nutrients aren't returning to the soil. The forests rely on fire to return the nutrients. So I'm, you know, with the Biochar in the Woods project, which is a network of people that are exploring ways to do this. We're recognizing that biochar is a form of biomimicry. So if we have these, you know, biomass choked forests, the first thing to do is to do the thinning work and make the piles and burn the piles, and then we can bring back prescribed fire. But we've had this step we have to do first. So we're doing it, but are we making char? You know, are we missing an opportunity to make char? And I think I already talked about this, but you know, in Washington and Oregon, up to 50% of the carbon in the forest soils is charcoal, just like Iowa. So these forests need charcoal. Okay, so here's one of the thinning project near my house, you know, from a few years ago, and this is typical. I'm sure a lot of you have done this or seen this. All these little piles, you know, there might be 100 of them in an acre, and it's great. We need to do this, but when you burn those piles, they burn so hot, and they're designed, you know, so compact to burn into their own footprint so they don't fall apart, but they destroy the forest soil. So, and they create a lot of smoke, and they don't leave behind much char. So can we do something better? Can we do a better job? Well, so there's a new term that we're using called flame carbonization. So you know how a bonfire works. It's just a bonfire, but it's controlled, and it's done with the intent of making char, so we understand how fire works. And the beginning of that understanding is realizing that biomass burns in stages. So you've got a piece of wood and you add heat to it. The first thing that happens is steam comes off of it. This is mostly steam. We just lit this, and it's smoke, but there's a lot of water in it. So it's steam, water vapor. Then once it's really starting to go and the water's gone, you start getting a flame. And that flame is like wood gas. It's like things like methane, hydrogen. And so that flame is burning gas. Now, when the flame is gone, and you've all seen this in a campfire or a burn pile, then you get this sort of pile of glowing coals. And those coals, you know, just like your char and your barbecue, there's no flame because the hydrogen is mostly gone. It's just carbon burning. It's the char burning, and it glows. And so that's because at that stage now, it only can burn when an oxygen atom actually physically contacts a carbon atom. So it slowly burns from the outside in. And as this picture here shows, that flame, when you're going to end up completely burning away a portion of the outer part of this log to get the heat to get in the center to char it. So to make char, all we have to do is cut this process off. We have to stop it right here before it goes to ash. So once you understand that, the principle of flame carbonization, everything else I'm going to tell you about how to make biochar is just going to be obvious. But I'm going to go through a few little details here about it. All right, so as we're looking at ways to get biochar production out in the woods to deal with the problem right there, we've got a few different technologies that we've been looking at. So the first one is, we call it a conservation burn. It's just a burn pile that's properly managed. The second one is different varieties of kilns that, like the Ring of Fire kiln, I call it a panel kiln because it's made of pieces that you can easily move and set up. And it's basically just a windscreen around a burn pile. Then there are other devices that are like bigger bins that usually they're heavy. They have to be moved with machinery and loaded with machinery. They're doing a lot of this in Utah, and you know, that's another option. And then finally, the Forest Service is developing this air curtain burner that has a char removal system, which is very nice, but it's expensive. So anyway, that's kind of the range of stuff. I'm only going to talk about the first two. I'm not going to talk about the other bigger ones. So method number one, the conservation burn. Here again, it's just a burn pile, but we do a couple things different. First thing we do is we try to light it on top, because keeping a flame on top means we burn the smoke. So it's a lot cleaner. And then we have to have some water available at the end so we can quench them with water and save the biochar. It's really that simple. Here's one of these top-down burn piles that we quenched. And I'm coming back a year later to see what's growing there. And all these things are growing there. And it's such a contrast to, you know, bare dirt and rocks that you see under a standard burn pile. This just shows the difference between lighting it on top versus lighting it down below. And people think you need a light right at the bottom of a pile to get it going, and you don't, because the heat transfers by radiation. So it ends up heat. You don't have to rely on the fact that heat rises by convection, because that flame on top is going to light everything underneath it on fire. So this is just a little schematic showing how it works. And you can see how we're building up our pile of embers and char underneath. And you know, we can keep adding material to an open burn like this until we get a really big pile of coals and then put it out. Here's a few different ways to do a pile. Like if you have bigger material, sometimes it's best to stack it in a rick like this. You can get it all the flame up at once and get a lot of heat at once. One of the takeaways about the flame carbonization technique to remember is that it works much better on small material than big material. And one of the things I've been trying to talk with a lot of people about, you know, who are doing this work is, are we sometimes maybe burning material that's bigger than we need? I mean, this is fine, this size, but do we really need to burn bigger logs, you know, 8-10-inch diameter logs? They're not a fire danger. We could be leaving them in the woods in a lot of cases, or recovering them for firewood. Here's a few different styles. Here's a ring of fire kiln. Here's a rick pile. Here is a kind of teepee pile where we put small stuff in the middle and laid big logs around it, which actually turned out to be a really good method. It held in the heat a little bit more. And you can see at the end, we still have some of the bigger pieces didn't completely char. But like I said, that's not a danger. That's not a fire danger. We can leave those on the landscape, and then we can scoop up the char and take it and put it in our gardens, or just rake it out on the land and leave it there to do some good right where it is. Just another illustration of the difference between putting it out with the water versus not. So you might get some char, you know, if you let it burn to ash, but you get a lot of ash on a lot of rocks. Whereas here we have green needles, fir needles underneath that pile that never even burned. So we didn't incinerate the soil. And just another picture of the aftermath, things growing up through it the next spring. So this is what you need for a project. You know, if it's just your backyard, you've got it easy. You've got a garden hose that can reach probably, and you know, you just do your burn pile as usual with making sure you put it out at the end with water. But if, you know, some people are doing this with large crews and doing acres, and what they need to do different than what they were already doing is they need a water tender. And, you know, and if it's way up on a hillside, you can get a hose, a small hose can reach half mile off of road. It's not that much of a problem. Or you could use backpack pumps. So you do your standard practice of cut pile and cover, usually with a little piece of plastic to keep the rain out of it. You light the piles on top, and then the crew needs to do a little bit more tending and quenching at the end. And you have char now all over your landscape instead of burn scars. So method number 2 I'm going to talk about is the flame cap kiln. And this is basically just a burn pile in a bin. So what happens here is it's more efficient than the burn pile because you got this pan that's keeping air out of the bottom and the sides. And so what happens is you keep adding more material. The char here is formed, but it's not going to burn because all the air is being used here at the top by the flame. So it's protected until the end from air. And the flame ends up forming a little cap here. I caught this picture here of a flame just kind of hovering down over the material because all the air has to come from the top. So it's not, you're not going to get many shooting flames. I mean, this picture shows shooting flames because these sticks are sticking up out of the kiln, but here's another picture that shows this counterflow air. So you can see that the burning biomass is just sucking the air down from the top, making this curly flame. So this is a kiln that we started developing through my project, and then I worked on a little bit more and got it to be a little slicker with a integrated heat shield. And I'm now selling these kilns, and I think there's a couple people in Trout Lake that have one. And so what I liked about this kiln was that it breaks down into little pieces that aren't too heavy. I could move it around myself with a friend. And the heat shield made a big difference in how efficient it was. So we could really make a lot of biochar pretty quickly. So this is the original version, which is 3 cubic yard capacity, and the manufacturing company in Medford, Oregon. And then I have a new version now that's a little bigger. So I like that better. It's almost 6 cubic yard capacity. So, and you can see this little picture here, if you can see on your screen, it's a heat map, and you can see how effective that heat shield is. So it's really makes it nice and easy to work around. You don't get fried with the heat, and it's really clean. And this is how it works, because when you have this extra heat shield, this extra layer, you have air coming up in between the two rings in that annular gap. That air gets preheated, and so when it gets sucked into the kiln, it really improves the combustion efficiency a lot. And then here's just our burn pile, and we're just keep throwing material in there until we fill it full of char. It's just a picture showing how, you know, it tends to suck the smoke back in. If there's not, if it's just your regular minor amount of smoke production, it's going to suck it right back in. This picture also shows these little loops of smoke getting pulled back into the kiln. So these are the basic steps for operating it. You're going to load it initially, usually with fairly small material, dry. You light it on the top, and you just keep loading it. And then at the end, you remove one of the panels and you start raking it out and spraying it with water. Dry materials works a lot better than wet material. So really encourage people to get a moisture meter and make sure your material is 25% or less is usually what I aim for. Then you assemble the kiln, the inner ring, and you build a dirt berm around the bottom to seal it. That's really important because you don't want air coming from below. You definitely want to start with your smallest, driest stuff for the first loading so you can build a hot fire very quickly. And you light it from the top. And when the first charge burns down to where you start seeing white ash and the flame dies down, now it's time to add more. And this is a little bit of the trick to it is knowing when to add more. But you let the flame be your guide. So you always want to maintain a strong flame on top. So, for instance, here somebody just put a big load of this material on here. You don't want to add more until the flame comes back up. And this is my little mascot here, little Pyro. And he says, always keep a strong flame on top because the flame's your heat source. If you let the flame die down by, because you didn't load it or you overloaded it, then you lose your heat source. just some more pictures of flames. You can see here, this kiln has been through a lot. It's pretty bent up, but it still works just fine. So you're going to keep adding material until you run out or you get tired. And, you know, this has been going for a couple hours, so we're ready to quench. So you wait till the flames die down, and then you start adding water and opening it up and raking it out. It's important to rake it thin because char has an amazing ability to hold heat. And I've come back, you know, a day after I thought I had a pile of it put out and found that there was still a pocket of hot coals that dried out the material, and it reignited and burned away half of my char. So you don't want to experience that. The charcoal is quite beautiful. Interesting stuff. So, you know, I've gotten into over the years trying to quantify what we're doing, because this is a carbon removal method. This is a climate change solution. And when I've got these cylinders I'm making biochar in, it's really easy to know how much you made, because before you empty it, you just kind of flatten it, level it all out, and then measure the distance from the top. And, you know, it's pretty easy geometry to figure out what the volume is. The bulk density is a little harder, but if you assume a cubic yard is 200 pounds, takes 10 cubic yards to make a ton. You can probably make 10 cubic yards in 5 or 6 batches with this kiln. And then, you know, sort of easy rule of thumb, 1 ton of biochar, which is carbon, is going to be 2.5 tons of carbon dioxide, because you add the oxygen molecules to it. So it actually is more. So, you know, 5 or 6 kiln batches is equal to 2.5 tons of sequestered CO2, which might be 10 or 20% of your annual emissions. So I just think that's an interesting thing to think about. And some of the bigger projects like the Redwood Forest Foundation and the California Conservation Corps did a lot of documentation of what they did. And then using our little multiplier, we figured that in 2 weeks they did this, they sequestered 38 tons of CO2. Another project in Montana also did a lot of good documentation, and you know, this was 21 acres, sequestered 35 tons of CO2. So that's pretty cool. And you know, actually we're getting to the point where it might translate into funding to help us do these projects. So, you know, we have only so much money to do fuels projects, and most people don't really want to spend a lot of extra money making biochar at this point. But if we can show them, you know, so if this is the money you have to do a fuels project, and this is how much it costs to make the biochar, there's a gap. So if we can get carbon removal payments to help fund that gap, then we can more easily do these projects. And so I'm working now with a group that's developing a protocol. They're actually based in South Africa, where they have a lot of similar problems with fuels and wildfire. And it's been really fun working with them, a bunch of young folks who know how to design apps and understand a lot of this stuff. And so there's different stages where if you're doing a project like this, you have to monitor, report, and verify what you're doing. And so this is the scheme. There's a desktop program you log into, and then when you're out in the field, you have your smartphone, and you do a few things to document what you're doing. So you take a picture of your biomass pile, you take a picture of your kiln, you take a picture of and some video during the burn, so you can verify that you had the flame and that it was clean. And then at the end, you take some a weight measurement of the char and a volume measurement, and you pretty much know what you've got. So these would be the steps, the verification points. So you take your feed with suck moisture, you verify the flame was good and the burn was clean. You can take a bucket of hot char before you quench it and weigh it. So you get a dry bulk density, and then you get a volume, and then you get a mass. And then at the end, you're going to set aside any pieces that didn't burn out of that volume. So this is, you know, an ongoing process in development, and it's very interesting. And I think it's going to take us some good places. So that's it. That's all I have for you. And wow, I did it in an hour. So I'm open for questions now.
Get myself back here. Yeah, folks, if you want to ask questions directly, just feel free to raise your hand. I can call on you and we can do it that way. We do have one question in the chat right now. Can you speak to the documentary, The Need to Grow, a huge biochar kiln?
Yeah, I did see that. I'm trying to remember what the technology was. What kind of kiln it was. You know, I can't remember what kind of kiln it was. It's been a long time since I've seen it. I haven't really heard much else about that though, that kiln or that project and how they're doing. It was interesting. Okay, I can just read these. So nasty smoky air pollution from folks burning brush piles. Could biochar making reduce the smoke? Yes, absolutely. You know, I mean, I had one day we were taking we had the kiln out, and I invited our fire district, one of our fire chiefs, to come out and see what we're doing. And I gave him the address, and we were back in the backyard a little bit. And he finally showed up. He said, I couldn't find you because I was looking for the smoke. And I didn't see any smoke. And then I heard the fire crackling, and that's how I found you. So yes, we can make a huge difference, either in a kiln or a properly tended burn pile. You know, it's just a matter of knowledge, really. And most people just don't really understand fire. And I've looked at a lot of extension materials on how to burn, you know, because there's stuff out there. If you've never done it before, you might go to your, you know, the Oregon Department of Forestry and say, what do they say about burn piles? And they'll say some useful things like, keep them small, you know, you don't want a huge pile, you know, have water on hand, you know, safety stuff, and that's all good. But they don't really explain how fire works, like I've just tried to explain to y'all, you know. And so people don't really know how to do it. So they'll throw in jumbles of stuff. They'll throw in dirt, they'll throw in, you know, if you have a few pieces of plywood in there, it might mess up your whole pile. They mix sizes. You know, one of the most important things you can do is just, you know, layer your pile so it's got air flow through it. That's going to make a big difference. And maybe you don't put like a big log here and then a bunch of little stuff. And then, you know, like even, you know, think about, do you really need to burn that big log? Or maybe take and stack a rick with the bigger stuff and put small stuff on top. We can do a lot better job with our burn piles. Is their material too small? Well, Scotch broom should be great. Yes, material, what's too small is chips. So if you try to, you can't do wood chips. You can't burn them in a pile or a kiln because they pack too tightly and cut off the airflow. So you want branchy material, as long as it's branchy. Like I've been doing hemp stalks, you know, and they're small, but they're branchy so that you can get airflow. And Scotch broom should be the same. You know, it just needs to be dry. I have not actually gotten to try green Scotch broom, but here's what I would do is, if you have some dry woody material and you had a ring of fire kiln, start with the dry woody material that you know you can light easily, get that going, get your bed of coals, and then start putting Scotch broom in. And I think that would work really well. Blackberry canes, yeah, absolutely. I've done a lot of blackberry canes. And someone asked about plywood. Why does it ruin the whole thing? Because, I mean, if you have one piece of plywood, it won't. But if you have different, you know, pieces of plywood, it just cuts off the air. So I have taken like boards, old lumber, you know, and those are really hard to burn because they tend to stack together and cut off air. but I laid them out in a log cabin rick. And when you looked at it, there was only about an inch between each board, but I didn't have any boards touching. I just made sure there was at least an inch of space between each board. And it worked great. It made a great pile, very clean. So it's the airflow. Burning leaves attached to branches. Yes, what can happen there, and I've done this with manzanita, is they take off and they make embers. So, they'll start flying through the air with a little ember, and you have to be really careful that they don't go off and start a fire. Okay, in Trout Lake, I made biochar by quenching with snow. Yes, snow quenching is a great idea. Then you don't have to worry about getting the water there if you're out in a remote place. A fire blanket. I actually, that was the Carbon Cultures kiln. And I actually sponsored a demo of that. They came down here to Cave Junction to demonstrate it. And it was really neat. The drawbacks to it were, one, it was very expensive. It was like a foil with a refractory paper attached to it. It helped to hold in heat, and it worked very well, but it was pretty darn expensive and not super durable. But the other thing about it was that you basically put this tent over a burn pile, and it made char, but it was just one burn pile. So if you had 50 burn piles on an acre, you need 50 of those, and they were very expensive. So yeah, it worked, but it wasn't very practical. So if a conservation burn isn't quenched and burns down to ash, will it damage the soil similar to a traditional burn? Or it will just be a traditional burn. If it burns down to ash, it's going to damage the soil, because the soil gets damaged not by the flame in the pile, but at the end stage when the charcoal burns. Charcoal burns really hot and it's sitting right on the soil. So it's not the flame that really burns the soil, it's that charcoal burning. So is that it? Anybody else have a question? Oh, do ring fire kilns have a lifespan? I'm sure they do. I've been making them since spring 2020 and using them, and those original ones are still in use. They got a little banged up and warped, but they're still usable. They haven't burned out, which is, I think, what you might be asking. The steel is still in good shape. Any other questions? Any questions about using biochar? So I have a lot of material on my website, and wilsonbiochar.com. I'll type that in here. And a bunch more questions are coming in. There are a lot of free guideline documents there in the shop. So you have to to get them, you have to check out through the shop, but they're free. I also have a biochar cookbook with some of my recipes, but I charge $4.95 for that. Okay, so for townies, what are good sources of biochar if you want to buy it in Washington? I'm not sure who's selling biochar in Washington. In Oregon, you can get it from Rexius in Eugene. Black Owl biochar is made in Washington, over on the coast. Look at the USBI, biochar-us.org. They have a directory, and there's a directory of biochar producers there. So I used to really know a lot more about the whole industry, but I've been focusing so much on the forestry part that I don't know. I won't share the slides. I'm sorry. It makes a file that's just too big to share, but a lot of this material, like I said, is on my website. So do you charge the biochar with other compost? What I really like to do, and you can mix biochar with compost, but it's really more effective to take your char and mix it with your ingredients first. So what I do is I have my kitchen waste and I put it in a bucket with biochar and bokashi, which kind of pickles it. So it's a lactobacillus. So I ferment my kitchen waste. That brings the pH down. And then you add the biochar to that and it balances the pH very nicely because biochar is very alkaline. And then I take that and I put it in my compost pile with grass and weeds and stuff like that. And it just makes a fantastic compost. So that's what I like to do. I've also used biochar in a worm bin. And again, you want to wet it. So, because worms don't like dry biochar, it scratches them. Crushing it. And let's see. Oh, okay, there's a lot of questions now. Sorry, you guys. I do have a couple more slides on crushing. Since we got a few more minutes, I will share my screen again and show you those. You can figure out how to share my screen. Share screen. Oh, geez, okay. So I always get a lot of questions about crushing. So I have these slides at the end in case somebody asks. There are different ways of crushing it. The easiest way to do it is to drive over it with a truck or a tractor. You can put it on a tarp in your driveway and just drive over it a few times. This guy had a lawn roller and a concrete slab that seemed to work. A chipper shredder, a roller mill, a hammer mill, a leaf vacuum. Here's a DR leaf vacuum. This was a pretty slick way to go. So you can just suck it up and it hits this impeller and it shatters very nicely. I ended up buying this electric hammer mill. And so it's just got a screen in there and all these little hammers. My chipper shredder has one too, but it tends to clog. The thing about crushing char is that when it's dry, it's really dusty. And when it's too wet, it gets very sticky and it will plug up a screen. So there's a sweet spot of moisture. What I usually do is I spread it all out on a tarp and let it dry in the sun. And then if it gets too dry, I'll just mist it with a hose, and that's usually enough. And that works pretty well. It's a little slow though. And a lot of times I don't even bother crushing it. If you're putting it in an animal barn, you don't need to crush it. Because the animals will do it. And it will, especially if you live in an area where it gets cold, it likes to fracture. It's pretty easy to crush. So over time, it will fraction, especially if you have a freeze-thaw cycle. 55-gallon drums. Yes, you can make biochar in 55-gallon drums. It's a lot slower than using a burn pile or a kiln. But for some things, like if you had chips, sometimes you can make those, you can char those in a 55-gallon drum. Recommendation for size. Okay, so really I like between, a 1/2 inch to up to 4 inches of dry material. That's going to give you the best results. If you have really dry material, it can go up a little bigger. But generally bigger stuff, save it for firewood. Is there a difference in types of wood burn in terms of how they affect soil and their end use? There is, but not necessarily a huge difference. There's probably more difference between, like, a lot of people are making biochar from straw or rice hulls or nutshells or other things like that. but especially the straw and the crop waste biochars are really different. They have a lot more ash, and they have different effects in soil. Mostly what I do is wood. And the main difference you'll get in different wood species, because we cook it at such a high temperature in the flame, there's not much else in it but carbon, but you'll get different densities. So like madrone or oak will be really dense, and pine or fir will be less dense. Can you quench it by covering it with a lid? Yes, you can. However, it can take a really long time. And do you want to leave a kiln full of hot char sitting there wherever it is, for a day or two? And if any air in it gets in it at all, it can reignite. I've given up trying to quench it by just covering it because I've lost too many loads of char. So I really want to put water on it. Okay, application amount to a garden bed. If you just have, say you just have a bucket of biochar, you just want to put it in a garden bed, just keep it to 1/4 to 1/2 inch spread across the top of the bed, and then lightly worked in, and that's a fine way to get started. If you want to plant it with a cover crop first, then you could add a little more. If biochar scratches worms, how about slugs? I don't know. I don't think I've seen it stop slugs, although I have snails and they're such a pest. I got so disgusted with them this year that I actually went around and one of my raised beds, and I just pulled all the weeds away with a hoe to bare soil, and then I put a really thick band about 6 inches around the bed to see if that would keep the snails away, and I think it seemed like it did. So yeah, but that was just like pure biochar. So you could try it. Beer works on slugs. So somebody's asking about taking an excavator and digging a hole. I would be careful with that. First of all, you can definitely, if you make a pit for biochar, think about how you're going to keep people from falling into it. I just want you to think about that. But the other thing is don't make it too deep. Like just make it maybe 1 foot deep, and that will help. And just because it'll create a little space for the char to fall into, that's going to be protected from air. And then it's a lot less trouble to try and dig it out, because trying to dig char out of a deep pit is not going to be fun. The other thing I've done is I had some old roofing steel, and I just put it on the ground, and then I had a pile of very small brush, like size of my small finger, and I made that pile on the metal and lit it on top, and it made so much char, I couldn't believe it, because I think the metal reflected heat back up, and because it was small, it was really efficient anyway, because it just like charred immediately. And so that's what I recommend to people who've got small brush, something like ceanothus or manzanita. You can just make a pile, and if you have couple pieces of old roofing steel around, put it on that, and that can be really efficient. I do encourage you to go to biochar-us.org. That's the US Biochar Initiative. That's where you'll find a directory of manufacturers of biochar, so you can figure out who's selling it in Washington and where you could buy it. And then there's also a whole library of information there. It's called the Learning Center. I helped put that together. It's got all kinds of different information about biochar and the biochar industry. So that's really worth taking a look at. The International Biochar Initiative also has a lot of information and webinars. And yeah, so there is a lot of good stuff out there. And one more thing I'll say, for those of you who think you'd like to get into the business of making biochar and maybe selling it, a lot of people ask me, how can you do that? And as a small scale, like, can I make biochar and sell it at the farmer's market? You could, but what I would recommend is make a value added product. So if you've got, 20 acres in a forest, and you've got, you have the opportunity to make a lot of biochar, maybe you end up making 10 cubic yards of biochar, and you don't want to just sell that as raw biochar. Go ahead and compost it, or, put it in a worm bin, make a biochar worm casting, or make a biochar bokashi blend or something like that. Then you add a lot of value to it. You can charge more money for it. Make it realistic, a realistic kind of small business. All right.
That was so fascinating. Thank you so much. And we can always keep answering questions, but I'll wrap it up for a few minutes here in case some folks are going to start to wander off. And I just want to thank everyone for their time and attention tonight. And I also want to thank Corinne and Casey and the WFFA group for bringing this idea to UCD to have Kelpie with us. And it's really been a pleasure to have you here, Kelpie, as our guest speaker. Thanks for presenting such fascinating details about making and using biochar. I know we all learned something new, and that hopefully we'll be able to incorporate this new knowledge into our natural resource management at home, and share this information with our friends and neighbors as well. So remember, this presentation was recorded and it will be available on our website soon. So check back, and we're going to put one more poll up just to gather some quick feedback on this workshop. So please take a moment to answer those questions once Jan puts that up. And if you have any other last minute questions, I'm sure we can throw those in the chat, or let Kelpie answer anything more here if anything else has popped up for you.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. It was a pleasure to be here with you. And, if you think of something afterwards you want to ask me, go ahead and send me an email. I'll try to respond. It's great to see such strong interest in this topic.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Chime in on that poll and we'll present the results as soon as it looks like everyone's answered. And thanks again for participating tonight.